Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session in September 2024. And we have Kashyap, who's going to do a continuation of one of the topics we covered in one of the last summits, and is going to be focused on improving mental health and security outcomes through flow states. Over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Denise, for giving me this opportunity to speak here at the summit today. And thank you, everybody, for joining. As Denise mentioned, my name is Kashyap Thimmaraju, and I'm the founder of FlowGuard Institute, a research and training company dedicated to advancing mental health and human performance in cybersecurity. I'm also the research group leader at the Mental Health and Cybersecurity Foundation, with the aim of supporting and promoting mental health in cybersecurity. And so today I want to talk about how we can actually improve mental health and security outcomes through flow states. But before that, I'd like to start off by asking what it's like to work in cybersecurity. And so if I think about this question, I think it's actually quite heroic. You know, we all have different roles, we come from different backgrounds, but at the end of the day, working in cybersecurity feels like we are defending against the bad guys. We're keeping the bad guys out, and we're doing good for the business, the country, and this world. And so if we look at what it's like to actually work in cybersecurity, there are certain characteristics, in particular security operations. So firstly, there is an increasing threat landscape. You know, if you look at the number of signatures VirusTotal or any antivirus generates, it's in the order of millions in some sense, because they're not only different threats, there are so many different attacks that are being generated on a daily basis. There's also an asymmetrical win for the attacker. So unfortunately, from a defender's perspective, the cards are stacked against us, as we have to constantly defend against all attackers or as many attackers as possible. But from an attacker's perspective, they have to just win once in order to compromise the system. Furthermore, people working in frontline security typically operate in a state of perpetual vigilance. So they're constantly looking for alerts, scanning through false positives, false negatives, and it can be quite demanding. Sometimes can be boring, but can also be very demanding as well. There's also an element of risk involved. So if the system gets compromised, there could be monetary loss, the reputation of the organization can be at stake, there could be loss of data, which could be intellectual property, which could be personal identifying information. And this can be quite challenging as well. There's also working in security is also intellectually stimulating, you know, because it feels like solving a puzzle, putting the pieces together, figuring out what vectors the attacker used, and putting all this together. There's also this element of winning, that if we figure out by scanning through all the logs and alerts, we're able to find the attacker, that gives us a sense of reward, and as well as that we won against the attacker by keeping them out. And finally, I think working in cybersecurity is actually very meaningful, because we're actually doing some good and it's in the service of others as well. And so given these characteristics, let's look at how it actually impacts people working in cybersecurity. So what's the state of mental health in cybersecurity? So Times.com put out a report in 2022 where they identified that 2/3 of the people they surveyed, and this was primarily across Europe and North America, that nearly 2/3 of those people experience significant levels of stress at work. And about 2/3 of them also stated that their mental health actually affects their productivity. So we can already see the sort of link between security outcomes and mental health over here. So having said that, this is the outline I have for today. In the first part, I'm going to talk about the state of mental health in cybersecurity, primarily from the perspective of stress and burnout and well-being. And then in the second part, I want to talk about how we can actually improve security outcomes by actually focusing on mental health. And then with the remaining time that I have, I'll open up for questions. So let's get started on stress and burnout in cybersecurity. I'd like to highlight a survey that was conducted by Multi-Team Solutions that was put out earlier this year, where they surveyed a number of people from Black Hat Europe in 2023. And what they identified is that 80% of the respondents said that they might hit burnout in the next 3 years or less. And then there was a survey conducted by Nominet Security in 2019, where they looked at CISOs. And what they reported is that nearly 91% of them experienced high or moderate stress. And nearly every CISO surveyed believed that their role is stressful. And close to 90% of these CISOs were clocking in more than 40 hours per week. So these are just a couple of statistics, or a few statistics. I've actually, in my research, come across 43 articles from 2024 going back just till 2019, reporting on mental health concerns in cybersecurity. In the academic literature that I've looked at, so far I've come across 10 papers that actually talk about or have studied stress and burnout in cybersecurity. And only, I would say, about 3 of them have actually used psychologically validated scales to measure burnout within the cybersecurity community and industry. And so my colleague and I together, we put out a survey on mental health, in particular burnout, engagement, and flourishing. And we actually asked a number of CISOs on these topics. And so what we identified is that many CISOs actually feel burnt out because of work. And in particular, we use what's called the Copenhagen Burnout Inventory, which is another psychologically validated scale that measures burnout, particularly from the perspective of exhaustion. And the reason we also chose this is because looking at the reports that I showed you previously, workload was a big issue, and feeling exhausted because of workload. And so what we can see in this graph is that about 7 out of the 13 people who actually participated in this survey reported feeling burnt out to a high degree or a very high degree out of 13 people. If we look at the scores a little more closely, in particular with respect to 5 questions that I've extracted from a whole bunch of questions, we can see that many people, or rather they scored rather high when they feel like they give more than what they get back when working with clients. They also feel emotionally and physically exhausted. And finally, they actually scored less than moderate when it came to having enough energy for family and friends during leisure time. And so what's interesting, I think, with respect to these questions and scores is when we compare it with the scores from healthcare and social workers used in the original paper that came up with this scale. And so what we can see is that nearly on all these 5 questions over here, the CISOs are actually feeling more exhausted than the people working in healthcare or in as social workers. But what's important to keep in mind is that the scores on the right of the healthcare workers were from people in Denmark. And I think most of us know that people living in Denmark are some of the happiest people in the world. And so the people we interviewed were mainly from from Europe and North America. There are some socio-cultural differences over there, but it does highlight the difference between CISOs and healthcare workers. So what's actually causing some of this stress? So there have also been reports on this. Again, the Nominet study found out that staying ahead of threats, securing the network and securing endpoints.
Sorry, man, can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
You know, when you talk about the previous slide, that
Yes.
the sort of relationships with, you know, CISO and healthcare workers, right?
Yes.
How clean and how close is that analogy, right? It is a good analogy for us to make.
So how close? What do you mean by how close?
How close is that analogy, right? Like, you know, if you know, it's like if you take other industries, are healthcare workers like a good sort of, you know, I say, you know,
okay,
number of people that or environment
compare against
connection to cyber. I don't know, maybe compare with firemen or compare with police, compare to other situations that might have stress, but that they don't have probably the level that we have, right? Or other professionals, right?
Yeah, so one of the reasons, so I think in general, if we look at research in burnout, I think even previous researchers like Maslach and others, they looked at a lot of social workers because these are the people they believe to experience a lot of burnout. Of course, burnout is prevalent across different industries and different workers, but I think working with healthcare workers and social workers is what they was their target population. The other reason that I'm comparing against this is because the scale that I used had data for this group of people. I mean, if we use the advanced, or rather, how this is going to be useful going forward is now we have a baseline for some CISOs, and now we can actually compare people within the cybersecurity industry with these numbers. I agree there are differences between social workers and security professionals. I don't have a clear answer on how good or how useful it is to compare against. One of the reasons is because we actually have this data right now.
When you mean social workers, you mean more like non-emergency, you know,
yes.
They are not frontline staff, right?
Not necessarily. So if I recall correctly, they could be doctors, they could be nurses, and so on. There's people working in prison wards and so on. They had a very broad set of people that they looked at.
Cool. Good stuff. Thanks.
All right. Okay, so coming back to what's actually causing the stress. So what are some of the stressors among CISOs? I touched upon, staying ahead of threats and securing the network and endpoints. There was another report by CINET on implications of stress on CISOs, and they identified that 77% of the people surveyed believe that it's a lack of resources in some sense that's actually stressing them out. And then there was another report by Green Shoe Consulting called The State of Stress in IT Security. And one point they identified in that report is the challenge CISOs face is identifying their scope of control and responsibility. And this last point is something that we'll see in one of the coming slides. When it comes to incident responders, there was actually a paper published earlier this year by Subigya Nepal and some of his then colleagues at Microsoft Research. And I found this paper to be really, really good because they conducted a number of surveys among, I think, over 20 incident responders, and they identify different categories of stressors. The first one is on workload. So I'd like to spend a few moments on this table because I think it's really relevant and hopefully it helps other people as well. So workload is a big one. And I think this is something that I've also come across in some of the literature that I've looked at. So not only is it high workload and constantly increasing, but it's the number of hours they work and the lack of human resources. So not only do they have a lot to do, but they have to do it with few people. The next is on timing. So working across time zones, but also the fact that um, they could receive an alert at any moment and might have to leave their personal commitments or family events to go on call. Next is on communication. This one's also, I think, interesting where people are looped into events that are not really relevant to them, or they're asked for help on other security investigations. And then there's this general resolution lag. So not being responsive enough or the turnaround time and so on. The other one is on training. So I think this is really challenging because as I mentioned, we have an increasing threat landscape and attackers tend to use different methods. And not only is the technology changing, so people feel the need to learn, but they lack the resources to do so. And with the increasing workload, this becomes even more challenging. The other issue is that of priorities. So there's a lack of prioritization from the management, maybe even conflicting priorities, or what's maybe even worse is the incorrect priority. So people going on something else that's actually not worth working on. And finally, I'd like to touch upon some of the miscellaneous stressors, which were the lack of coping skills in stressful situations, um, imposter syndrome, repetition of tasks, which leads to boredom, and the last one being lack of recognition. And I think this is really, really important because if we are not recognized for the work we do, we don't feel good, and that sort of brings our motivation down and affects our mental health as well. So to sort of summarize what the security practitioner's experience is from the stress and burnout perspective or the negative aspects of mental health, we have the following, where we have our security practitioners feeling stressed, anxious, bored, maybe even burnt out, fatigued, overwhelmed, have a lack of autonomy, not recognized, maybe even lonely as well in certain situations. And feeling all this, they're responsible for keeping the bad guys away from our systems or defending our systems against attackers. And so what about the opposite? What is the opposite of feeling burnt out, right? Because there's a lot of literature and reports on people feeling stressed and lonely and burnt out, but what about the other side, which is engagement in cybersecurity? And if people are engaged, in particular the security team, they'd feel motivated, they'd be in a state of flow, perhaps, feel happy, productive, have a sense of control, feel challenged, have a sense of well-being. And if we look online, at least for what there is on this aspect, unfortunately, there's not all that much. If we look for engagement in cybersecurity or worker engagement in cybersecurity, what we see is how we can actually engage employees with the security team. And in fact, one of my colleagues, Andrew Reeves, who's also done some seminal work in mental health and cybersecurity's paper shows up, which is on engaging the workers or employees with security mechanisms, controls, or the team itself. And so the paper that I mentioned earlier from Subigya Nepal and his fellow researchers at Microsoft Research made a really good observation where they observed that engagement negatively correlates with burnout scores. And the burnout group reported less engagement overall than the non-burnout group. So what this means is that if people feel engaged, they're less likely to feel burnout. So in addition to the burnout survey that we put out, we also ask people, or in particular the CISOs, in which areas they flourish in. And so we used the Secure Flourish Index developed by Professor Vanderweel from Harvard University, where they have the Harvard Flourishing Program. And what we identified is shown in the table on the right. And so these are divided into broadly 6 categories. And I'm going to touch upon a few of them right now. So what we can see is that the people who actually participated in this survey were much more than the people who actually participated on questions related to burnout. So it seems like people are more open to sharing areas they flourish in compared to talking about how exhausted or burnt out they feel. So what we see is that the people who answered these surveys actually fare quite well when it comes to financial and material stability, and in aspects of character and virtue. Scores were roughly moderate when it came to happiness and life satisfaction, and a sense of meaning and purpose in life. And I would say less than moderate when it came to social relationships and physical and mental health. And I think the relationships part also ties in with a survey that was reported, I think, last year by Gartner, and also an CISO from Intel, Malcolm, I forgot his last name, talked about this, where many CISOs actually have this feeling of isolation, which is connected with their satisfaction with relationships as well. And so the secure flourish
on that one, sorry, how do
yes.
you read these data? Right, so I'm just trying to look at the numbers. If you go back, well, like,
yes,
is it 1 to 10? Like, what's the?
Yes. Okay. So this is actually a 0 to 10. The score is on a scale of 0 to 10, and people are asked to rate themselves on a score of 1 to 10. How often, for example, do you worry about safety, food, or housing, for example?
Okay, and then
And
the 2.5, is that
that's the standard deviation. So the score is the average score.
Yeah.
Of all the people who answered that question. So
Yeah.
23 people answered that. The
Yeah.
average score was 7.96 with a standard deviation of 2.25. So that means from a score of, let's say, close to 10 and 5, 2/3 of the people scored between 5, or let's say 6 and 10. That's what it's sort of saying.
And then it's like a yes or no, right, to this. Is that so?
No,
So
it's
saying that a lot of people worried about safety and food and housing and stuff like that, or not a lot of people worry about
Oh,
that?
yeah. Okay. It's interesting. So here, a higher score actually means they don't worry so much about it. It's a
Okay.
reverse.
Because I
Yeah.
was like, okay, so so that's the
That's a
lowest
good point.
score, means
Yes.
they worry
Yes.
more about it, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I
Yes.
think it's interesting because also, at the end of the day, right, like, cybersecurity is not, is not one of those professions that like, for example, like, we're reasonably well paid, right? I think if you ask, for example, teachers, right,
Mm-hmm.
clearly, like, you have teachers who, who not, unfortunately, they're not very well paid, right? So they would have
Absolutely.
much higher, right, in there. Okay, I get it, right? And then it's the ones
Absolutely.
below, right? Yeah. Well, then it gets interesting. Like, the last two are killer one, right? Your physical
Yeah.
health and overall mental health.
Exactly.
Bloody hell.
Exactly. And this is connected also with the burnout scores also, where people feel exhausted, emotionally exhausted and physically exhausted as well. So they're correlated in that sense. Of course, I've not conducted any statistical analysis on that, but we can see that.
But dude, even like that one, overall, how satisfied are you with life?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's a very heavy question, right? And not only half, right?
Yeah. And of course, we have to keep in mind that the number of people over here who have answered the question is not very high. It's about 14 to 23 people.
Yeah.
So it's not very high, but it still gives us an
Yeah.
estimate, where it's going. I think the next slide might also be interesting because over here, the Secure Flourish Index is used to measure well-being and human performance in a workplace setting. And they did this by, I think, surveying over 1,000 people from 2 Fortune 500 manufacturing companies. And so over here, we can see the scores from those people in the manufacturing companies. And so these are office workers plus the manufacturing workers on the right. And what we see is that, with respect to financial and material stability, the CISOs were slightly above those scores. But when it came to, from purpose, life satisfaction, health, and social relationships, these scores were much lower than the average scores from the manufacturing workers.
Yeah, and the manufacturer there, it's a lot more consistent, right? You kind of tend to see
Yeah.
that. There's also people that are always happy, people are always miserable in life, right? So there's a bit of them. But, and it's also interesting on the manufacturer, you get the dip on normal monthly expenses, which makes sense, right? With the cost of living crisis, etc. And I think what's interesting is the dip in cybersecurity is way bigger, right? There's a much wider variations, right? Yeah, really interesting.
Yes, that's why I think the standard deviation is also typically a little more over here. So there's some variance. We have some people who feel their health is sort of good, but then there's also an equal number who don't feel that way. But the average score is rather less.
Yeah, but even with your standard deviation, like your standard deviation is still lower than the other one, right? At the highest number. So yeah.
So I have a question by Roman. What's the number of CISO responding in this slide versus no? Yes, again, so that's shown on the previous slide. It depends on the question, but we had a max of 23. So of course, and I admit, we have fewer CISOs who participated in this. We would need a lot more people to actually come to something more meaningful, but it does offer us some sort of estimate as to what the current state is right now, and of the people who participated in the survey. So one of the goals also is to actually get more data so that we can have a broader view of the current state of mental health among people in cybersecurity. I hope that answers your question, Roman. All right, cool. Okay, with that, so based on this, I actually believe that if we want to have better security outcomes, I think it's really important that we focus on reducing stressors and improving engagement. There's a lot of reports on the stressors and the presence and prevalence of stress and burnout, but there's barely anything on engagement. And there's, I would say, even less on how this is actually connected with security outcomes. In fact, there was a sort of meta-analysis of stress among security workers, and what they identified as one of the open questions is, what is the link between stress and, let's say, productivity among security workers? So with that, I'd like to move on to the second part of this talk, which is on actually transforming the security practitioner's experience for better security outcomes. And I want to qualify this by saying that I don't have all the answers to this, and I don't claim to know how we can solve this, but I think I do have an idea of maybe in what direction we can go that might seem promising. And the second point I want to make is that I don't have any specific solutions right now, but ideas that we can use, or a paradigm that we can think within to help us make this shift, because it's about working at the individual level, at a team level, at a cultural level, and at a national level as well. So with that,
one quick comment. One of the things also very important in what you were talking before, and I always found this when I talk about my teams about it, is that one of the reasons why mental health is so problematic in cybersecurity is because we're also very driven by events, right? So if you think about
Yeah.
it, we a team that not only there's a lot of stuff going all the time, there's moments in time where you have these peaks of
Yes.
high activity, high energy, high
Exactly.
stress, right? Because you
Yeah.
have an event, right? And if you have a team that it's already like maxed out,
Yeah.
the burnout is ridiculous, right? So I always tell
Yeah.
the team, like I actually consider a risk when you have teams that are already super stressed and
Yeah.
almost at normal times, right? Because you need to be able to spike up and not blow up half your team in the purpose,
No.
because then you need clear heads, and you don't have clear heads if everybody's already crazy
Yeah.
stressed.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with this. There is, yeah, this is also what makes it challenging, right? You have these periods, perhaps even long periods of inactivity or maybe even boredom. And then all of a sudden, okay, we got to hit peak performance right now and not be stressed. And then everything's going chaotic in some sense. So yes, I
And we don't
completely
control
agree.
the timing, right? So if you think about it, like I remember for this organization, they have like PTSD with like Black Friday, right? Or with Christmas or
Yeah,
with
yeah,
certain, but at least you can plan for it. At least you know
yes,
when it's
yes.
going to hit, right? I think in
Mhm,
cybersecurity, we don't know when it's going to hit, right?
mhm,
Usually it's Friday night, right? After
mhm, mhm.
people say have a good weekend, right? And then
Yes, yes,
the
yes,
whole
yes.
thing
This is
goes from
also
there, right?
something I've come across. Yes, that certain events occur when we least expect it, or we don't know when it can occur. And yes, on maybe holidays and so on.
Yeah. And I think the more you practice, the better for that, right? The more you can react. Cool. All right, sorry.
Mhm. All right. So, I want to sort of touch upon this coming from a software engineering perspective. And so I think many businesses today are sort of rely on technology and they rely on software developers. And so it makes sense that if we want our products and services to do well, it's important that our developers are also cared for, they're productive, and they have a good sense of well-being and life satisfaction. And so there's also been a number of reports of developers feeling burnt out and so on. And so there was a paper published at ACMQ talking about DevX, or the developer experience. And what they believe is that the it's important to focus on developer productivity and well-being to actually um, to have better outcomes, right? And so some of the researchers, they identified around 25 socio-technical factors that actually drive productivity and well-being among developers. So this could be like interruptions, code review time, build times, um, number of meetings, or number of emails received and sent, and so on. And what they came up with in this particular paper is this concept of DevX, which is based on three core dimensions: feedback loops, cognitive load, and flow state. And what I'm interested over here today and I want to talk about is this concept of flow state. And I believe to enter flow state, we need feedback loops, better feedback loops, and we got to focus on reducing cognitive load. So what is
Is this
flow state?
flow state
Yeah.
kind of equivalent to what people call the zone, like when you just in
Yes,
the groove, right?
exactly.
Cool,
I
cool,
was
cool.
just about to ask that. Yeah, yeah. So what is flow, right? What is it to be in flow? It's about being in the zone, um, where we sort of lose sense of time in some sense, or it feels effortless. Um, we've probably experienced this in different activities, music, arts, sports, and so on. But we can also experience this in our work as well. There's a lot of literature on coding being another flowy activity. And the word flow actually came up from research done by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, where he actually interviewed a number of people to identify um, this so-called flow experience. And many of them said it just feels flowy. And that's how they came up with the word flow. And it is actually a science in positive psychology, and there are defining characteristics to being in the flow state. And so there are a number. I've outlined over here. The first one being the challenge to skill ratio. So to be able to get into the flow state, it's important that the task or activity at hand just slightly exceeds our current skill level. Because if it's too challenging, then we might feel anxious. If it's not challenging enough, it feels boring. And so it's sort of like this sweet spot we got to find when we're working on something. Next is feedback. We need feedback on the activity that we're performing so that we know that we're either doing good or not good, or what the sort of performance level is. Another characteristic of being in the zone or in flow is this warped sense of time. Typically, time would slow down. So we'd feel like 1 hour is only 5, maybe 15 minutes or so. There's also this sense of effortlessness to it. Even though there is a challenge to the activity that we're doing, it still feels effortless because we kind of know what we have to do or what we want to do spontaneously in some sense. And then there is this feeling of complete concentration. And one of the reasons why we feel so focused is also because there's a clear goal. Our brains, or us humans, we are goal-directed creatures. And so if we have a goal, that helps us focus. And if we can focus, then we can get into the flow. Next up, we have what's called transient hypofrontality. What that means is just a fancy way of saying that the inner critic inside our mind sort of tones down, and we're not worried or thinking about what others might be thinking of what we're doing. Next is what's known as the autotelic, which is merely doing the activity or the task for the joy of it. And finally, we have autonomy. And I think this one's really huge. We have, what that means is to be able to be in the flow state, we also have to have this sense of control over what we're doing and sort of carving out the path or the steps that we want to take to actually perform the task. And so how does flow actually help? Yeah, Denise.
Yeah, so on that one, and I actually spent a lot of time analyzing this, and I recognize that myself, and I think it's really cool. I just add that what I realized, my personal experience, you also have 2 types of flow. You have the flow, which maybe is calling like discovering the cure, or like where there's a very binary outcome, right? Like you either do it or you don't do it, right? Like, so this is very binary outcome, which there's still a flow, but I think there's a higher degree of stress because you don't know if it's going to work. You don't know. And there's a lot of tangents you go, that dead ends that you have to come back, right? You're still in the flow and you have a lot of these things here, right? But, and then the other flow, which I found is a lot more interesting and rewarding and nicer, is when you just succeeding, right? The question is, how much will you succeed? It's like you already got there, or you already have a level of, let's say, either a product or a solution or something. The question is, at that moment in time, a little bit of effort gives you a high yield of result. So you kind of keep going because it's kind of like it's you're still in that zone, right? You're still in that hyper productivity mode where, you know, in a way, the other one, it's more binary, right? Either you succeed or you don't succeed, right? And but it's super powerful, right? Those zones, because it's, you know, it's, and I can completely relate to all of them, right? It's and anybody, you know, it's also very rewarding when you're there, right? And you don't feel stressed. Like I remember sometimes I would do, like, even recently, because I'm doing a startup, like sometimes you get into these zones and you do like 12, 14 hours of development, and I'm fresh as a daisy, right? Like literally, you know, and sometimes you do 3 hours of work and you're ridiculously stressed, right?
Exhausted.
And there's also a thing in your brain when it's almost like you're uploading stuff to your brain. You kind of creating these mental models, and then once you're there, you are, again, you reach that hyper productivity, right? Because you got that stuff. So yeah, absolutely, right. And that's what we want. But I now also, I like where you're going, because I think we can create those environments, right? A lot of this can be measured. A lot of this actually, it doesn't just happen by accident, right? And because I try to now also social engineer in my world to be in those positions, right? Where you leave that flow, right?
Absolutely.
And a good analogy you might want to draw on too is professional athletes, right? Because especially the ones that play from every week, right? So if you think about it, or even the Olympics, but that's more extreme. But think about it, the professional athlete, part of their skill is to be able to be in the flow on Saturday at 3 p.m. Right? It's not good enough if the dude's on, the lady is on the flow on a Thursday or on the practice. Somehow they have to find a way to be in that zone, and then so I think some of the stuff that I do, I feel like my zones are wider. It's kind of like I have 2 weeks, a month, a week, where you go and then you kind of off, and then you recognize it. Where there's others where it's more of a spike, right? You have to get yourself into that flow and then have a wind down so that you can then have calm between the flows, right?
Yes. After that last part is also really critical, the recovery phase, because so we don't want to be in the flow state like all day, every day, all year, right? Because it's actually very exhausting. There are all these neurochemicals that are released in our brain that make it feel so good, but they also get depleted and they exhaust us also at the end. And so it's only through recovery that we can be able to regenerate all those chemicals and then actually get back into the flow.
And I find that I also need to shut down a lot of other stuff, right? And that's the problem we have, for example, in normal businesses, is that you barely get 2 hours in a row. Might as well 10 hours, might as well 3 days. And it's a mistake because you need there's a ramp up, right? For you to get to that productivity. Like, you don't just flick the switch.
You can. No. It would be nice. There are potential ways. Perhaps even these professional and elite athletes have figured out these triggers that they can use to be able to get into the zone quickly. But that takes training. That takes, some level of autonomy over their schedule. They need the environment around them.
Yeah, and I think the other variable we might want to add to this is mainly because we work in software and we work in a more dynamic industry. There's a lot more unknowns, right? This is where I don't know how much you look at Worldly Maps. I think if you look at, and there's Simon's here tomorrow on the summit, but Worldly Maps talks about the genesis, custom built product, and commoditization. And yes, you have the flow in a lot of them, but I think the flow that we tend to have in cybersecurity is one where there's a lot more unknowns, right? There's a lot more things that are new that we're discovering, where I think it's easier to get into those sort of peak flows when it's more of like, it's a known thing. Like, for example, like the athletes, the rules are not going to change every Saturday, right? Like, it's almost like the rules of the game, the pitch, there's things. So it's almost like you need to get in a specific zone, where in security, like we sometimes have zones that are like game changer, but it's a much wider field of operation, right?
Yes.
You operating, and with a lot more people in the business, right? Again, adds to the mix.
Yes. There are more dependencies. And I think I'll touch upon that, but I think that's also what may be preventing people from getting into the flow, is this lack of control and autonomy. I'll come to that in a moment, if I may.
And one of the things that you mentioned, and it's funny because I have to say that I found a very sane way not to have a lot of stress. Sometimes I would feel guilty in these CISO, dinners and panels where everybody's stressed the hell out of it. I'm the guy saying, like, I'm not that stressed. And the reason why is I was able to rationalize and say, there's a line where the business is making the decisions, right? And you have to understand that, or the market, or the attackers are. There's a bunch of things you don't control. And I used to tell that to my team too. Like, I saw a lot of cybersecurity professionals buying the risk for the business, and I'm like, dude, it's not your risk is not yours, right? Like, I know you could do something about it, but you don't control 95% of what causes that risk. So don't take it personally, right? Because that stress is caused by the business, by a decision made, by the environment, by third parties, by a lot of stuff that's outside your control. So don't internalize that risk, right?
Yeah, I think that's sort of that's an important part. It comes to this locus of control, this internal locus of control, external locus of control, and what's sort of driving them. Do they derive it from the outside, or sort of are they assuming the risk? I think that's what you mean. Yeah, interesting.
They're buying the risk, right? They almost feel that it's a failure on their person or professional if that happened. And I sometimes try to explain, no, it's not, man. If that happened, like we had to make a decision whether to protect these versus protect that, and we can't protect it all. So if this happens, it's just meant that whoever made that call either made the wrong one, or you made a hedge bet, right? But you can't be stressful for things that you don't control, right?
I think it's also connected with what I touched upon earlier, which is there's also this hero culture within security, right? Like we feel like we want to do the right thing, we want to save or defend our systems, and so people tend to sort of they take it upon it's their personal mission in some sense.
And I think there's the story of Superman as the hero, which actually is the bad thing. Have you heard of that story?
Not sure.
It's really a cool idea that Superman is, like he's in this place and there's a kid playing, and eventually the kid falls off. Superman comes along and saves the kid, right? And we go, yay, Superman did a great job. The interesting thing is, the real hero is the person who grabbed the kid before he even fell off and did put him on the ledge, right? It's kind of like we celebrate the captain of the ship that hits the iceberg and gets everybody alive and is the last one to leave. What we should be doing, and security, I think we have a lot of these, we should be celebrating the captain that goes around the iceberg, always a mile, who never hits the iceberg, who never creates that problem in the first place. And I think you're right. The hero, again, in cybersecurity is a problem, right? Because we don't want heroics, right? We want, in a way, those things to be a lot more under control, right?
Yes.
And I feel like you're touching a really cool part here, which is, how do we get the teams in security to operate on that flow where they
exactly.
Right?
Yeah. So that's sort of the key idea over here. How can we apply this concept of flow within the cybersecurity workforce based on these characteristics? And this could be done at an individual level, at a team, and an organizational level.
So that's what the key here is, to be able to put a number to this, right? So the hypothesis here is that if you have 5 teams, one is ridiculously stressed, the other is not, we should be able to have a risk metric in the business that takes that into account. But at the moment, there is no place to put that risk, right? But I would argue that the team that is crazy stressed might look that is doing a lot of other stuff, but is a team that any external thing that happen will blow up. Where the team here that not just is being a lot more productive is a team that when events happen, either they already have a lot of things so they don't allow crisis to occur, right? They're much more healthy. The problem, I think, in business today is that we have a lot of metrics to cover some of the bad stuff that's happening. We don't have, I think you mentioned, good metrics for proactive work, good measures to measure, hey, this is what didn't happen because we were doing this. And you have to measure it. At the end of the day, like, you have to be able to make rational decisions about some of these things.
Yes. Is it okay if I go to the next slide? Yeah. Okay. Because I think I'll touch upon what the metrics part in some sense, I believe. So if and we've just discussed this, right? Like if we look at flow in cybersecurity, we barely see anything in this. There's one sort of, let's say, research paper that talks about how we can use a flow to help people learn about cybersecurity measures, but not really how can we apply the concept of flow in cybersecurity, with the exception of, I believe, James Turner, who had a talk on using concepts of flow in cybersecurity. And this is sort of like the only thing I could find out there that's so tightly connected with flow and cybersecurity. And so just like the burnout flourishing surveys, we also asked the CISOs a bunch of questions related to flow, so we can sort of measure how well people are able to get into the state of flow, or which of those characteristics they score high on and which ones not. And so then we can identify ways in which we can help them get into a state of flow. And what we can see is over here, well, the max score, this scale is on a scale of 1 to 7. And what we can see is that the CISOs who participated in this survey actually have a good sense of feedback and they feel like they have the skills to meet the challenges that they face, and they have clear goals. But they lack a feeling of total control, um, and are not able to focus on the task at hand, perhaps because they're also worried about what others are thinking of them. And this is perhaps preventing them from being in a state of flow.
So
Um,
these are the
yeah.
ones who have the flow, right?
So these are questions related to the different characteristics that I talked about over
Yeah,
here,
yeah, yeah.
and it sort of it scales that. So how good are you with respect to your challenge to skill ratio? And these questions were prefaced with the question, what was it? With respect to my security activities, dot, 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 I have a good idea while I'm performing. I feel I am confident and so on.
The thing I would say on this one, the last three, I literally
Yes.
see myself putting that low.
Mm-hmm.
To me,
Mm-hmm.
they are a good thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I would argue that, you know, to have a feeling of total control, right? Actually, you cannot have that. You
No.
have to accept that it's almost like you have to be comfortable and almost saying that loud that says, I'm not worried about what others thinking about me. I don't
That's
have
important.
total control. And I think if you don't make peace with that, then you can't
Yes.
achieve the others, right?
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's really cool because I have two young girls, like 2.5 and 5, and I don't know about others, but being a parent,
Yeah.
I'm a person who feels like I need a lot of control, and with kids at
You
this
have no
age,
idea.
I
I
have
have
no
two daughters,
control.
19 and 20. You just, my advice to you, just assume you don't have control. Just
Exactly.
start there,
Exactly.
because they will find whatever you are and they're gonna poke it, they're gonna push
Yeah.
it. But it's amazing.
Exactly.
But you
Yes.
have to start there, right?
Yes. And that's the same concept over here. So we first come up with the sense of acceptance. Okay, I do not have control, but then it's like reframing it. Okay, so what can I have control over here? Um, oh, by the way, I don't know if we are how good are we on time? We have
Probably
about
good. It's
four
fine.
minutes.
It's a recording, right? It's fine. We
Okay.
can, we'll trim this
Okay.
down. We do the thing eventually. We know that we'll publish this all, but it's a good example of there's lots of great nuggets here that we need to
Yeah.
find a way to do the thing.
Okay. Okay. Cool. But yeah, this is sort of the thing. Like it's then reframing it to identifying ways where we can feel a sense of control. And I think this is where, the internal locus of control comes into picture, or having a growth mindset. So even
Yeah.
if I know I have to do this, what are ways in which I can say, okay, I'm going to do this first, and that sort of gives us this sense of control.
Did
And
when
maybe we
your
might, yeah.
daughters catch your own inconsistencies, especially when you try to have these more rational conversations? You
Uh,
have a couple more years, but when they get to 7, 8, 9, they
yeah,
will use their own logic against you.
yeah, against me.
Which is great, by the way, but it's really funny when you see them catching your own inconsistencies, right? And they sharp on, right? So, but it's great. You're gonna love it. But
Oh man. Okay. I'm already preparing myself for the future. Okay, so this was on measuring flow um, of CISOs. Oops. So how do we actually get more flow in cybersecurity? So I'm going to touch upon a few. I think the first one I've already touched upon while Denise and I were talking. I think it's absolutely important for recovery. So recovery includes sleep. That's like a must, because it's only during sleep that certain brain chemistry changes that allows us to be more vigilant during the day. Without that, we won't be able to regulate our emotions very well. We won't be able to make good decisions. We won't be able to catch, let's say, a true positive from the false positives. And I also have active recovery in here because in addition to sleep, we also need to engage our so-called parasympathetic nervous system, which is part of our nervous system, or the autonomic nervous system, that's responsible for the rest and digest, right? So this is being able to handle the stressors and trigger the chemistry in our body to be able to get into a state of flow in the future. And so this would involve some kind of stressful activity only for a short time, but that actually makes us feel good at the end, So like some kind of sports, it could be mindfulness, meditation, whatnot. There are a number of activities out there. Get in touch with me and I can share a list with you. But this is absolutely important because without this, it's going to be very hard to get into the state of flow. Next is working on burnout triggers. So workload is a huge thing. Identifying ways in which we can reduce our workload, either by distributing it among people or automating or even getting rid of things, We saw from the table that I discussed earlier that incorrect priorities are an issue that actually trigger increasing workload. So what are priorities or tasks or activities that can actually completely ditch or push to another time to actually reduce our stress? Next up would be values and community. I mean, if we are working in an organization whose values don't align with your personal values, that's a sign that you don't want to be part of that. Community is also huge. If we don't have a sense of community within the organization that we're in, this is also going to lead to burnout. So it's really important to not feel isolated and be part of a bigger team that gives us the sense of meaning and purpose. I think this is also connected with recognition, which I already touched upon. Fairness is also really important. It's really, really critical that the cybersecurity team and the people working within the team are treated fairly and not just pointed at when something goes wrong or being used as a scapegoat when a breach occurs. And finally, control or autonomy. If we feel like we don't have a sense of control in our job, that's a sign that we might want to look at other opportunities or speak with our supervisors, managers, or leadership to find out ways in which we can gain more control. Next one would be on the flow channel. So I also touched upon this, being feeling anxious or bored. And to be able to get into flow, we want to have the skills to meet the challenges at hand. And so for some people, this might actually mean learning something, picking up new skills so that we can actually meet demanding challenges. For others, it might mean taking on more challenging tasks already if you already have skills, right? And without this, it's going to be really hard to get into the state of flow. Clear goals and flow accuracy. I mean, we touched upon having the right priorities and having the right goals. So we might be able to get in the state of flow if we have a goal, but if that goal is not right, we might go down a rabbit hole that's actually completely not worth it. So I think it's also really, really important that we have established goals and priorities that align with, let's say, what the business goals are and objectives are. And this is actually going to help us be in the state of flow more often. We also touched upon autonomy. And this is also really important. So I mentioned, maybe reframing certain situations where we feel a sense of control will help us get into flow. And finally, reducing cognitive load. So think of cognitive load as the RAM in our brain. And if, just like our computers, if we have too many applications open, we're not going to be able to perform so well. So one way of looking at this is closing all those applications that are not necessary. And so that means not thinking about all those things that we don't have to think about when we're working on a particular task. It might also mean just putting things like a brain dump in some sense. So we just get everything, externalize our thoughts, so we free up our mind for the task at hand. It also involves not context switching or multitasking, right? This can also increase cognitive load. So we want to unitask and focus on a particular task or activity rather than switch between the two. And that's going to help reduce cognitive load. And with that, I'd like to wrap up and share some of the key takeaways. So firstly, we saw that stress and burnout are prevalent in the cybersecurity industry. There is a lack of research on productivity and well-being and flow in cybersecurity. And I believe the science of flow actually promises to help prevent burnout, improve engagement, and improve security outcomes for the security team. I'd like to sort of end with a few points on what you can do. So first off is I would encourage each of you to sign up to the charter at the Mental Health and Cybersecurity Foundation. So if you are in the capacity to champion this, I strongly encourage you to do so. If not, please find someone at your organization who can and get in touch with us. We have a community of practice meeting once a month. So you can reach out to us at cop@mhncsfoundation.org. We also have the research group, so feel free to get in touch with me or send an email out to us as well. We also have the Human Performance in Cybersecurity Survey. So if you would be interested, please participate in that. That would help us get more data and insights into what the current state of mental health is in the cybersecurity industry. And finally, check out our research paper. And I've also put out a bibliography on stress and burnout literature in cybersecurity. There are about 53, let's say, resources that I've put together so far, and I will continue to increase as well. If you have any feedback on this talk, I'm happy to hear that. Always looking for ways to improve. And with that, I'd like to open up for any questions anybody has.
No, this is great, man. I don't have any on my side unless you had some on your side.
Sure.
I think you need to add an element of risk to this, man, because I think this is bigger. I think I think it's important what you talk about. I think it's even much bigger because I think there's a risk element here to that we should be mapping and tracking, right, from a business point of view. And this is where I would talk a little bit before. I think the Gen AI LLM angle is that as we are able to map more how organizations operate, I feel that, again, the mental health and the mental state of some individuals and the preparedness of individuals becomes a much bigger touch point, right? I think it's an example of today we are so inefficient in mapping risks that we can't even map that one. But I feel that a lot of the teams that have done that, and not just this, like, for example, we should also remember that we are one of the teams that interacts with everybody, right? So if you think about it, the other thing, I said sometimes I feel people absorbing their own risks. I also see sometimes of my team members absorbing the risk and absorbing the stress of the organization, because the organization interacts with us. So if you think about it, like we are one of the few organizations we're not the few teams in the whole organization that can talk to everybody. But by design, it means that you absorb also a lot of stress that exists in the organization. You deal with a lot of teams that don't talk to each other, teams that hate each other, parts of the business that don't make sense, parts of the business that are ridiculously stressed. And we are there in the middle trying to get stuff done, right? So I think there's also a lot of stress that we get from the business, where it's not like the whole business is not stressed and we are the only pocket of high stress, right? I think there's also an element where a lot of cybersecurity is also absorb a lot of stress from the business who are in those situations.
I like that. Absorb the risk and stress. Yeah.
Because if you think about it, like what's interesting is I have to say, in my journey as a CISO, what I realized that there's a lot of things you can do yourself, and then my strategy was always to isolate my teams from, in a way, the business, to let them get on with it. but there's a moment where you can't protect the business unless you change the business. And that
Mm-hmm.
puts you squarely into the whole business change management, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the way you make some things better is you actually have to change how some of the business operate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's much more
Mm-hmm.
stressful because you're operating in a much more complex world
Yes, yes,
where
yes.
even people don't want to do things, not because they don't think it's a good idea, it's just because it's not aligned to their business model, it's not aligned to what they're rewarded, it's not aligned with where they're going. So I kind of found that there's a moment that you have to realize that you're trying to change the business, and change is
Mm-hmm.
always difficult, and change
Yes.
always brings stress, right?
Yes.
At that level. And we happen
Mm-hmm.
to be
Mm-hmm.
like almost in the middle of that, right? In addition to
Mm-hmm.
all of the stress that you talked about, we also have those there.
Yes, yes, yes. That's yeah, that's very insightful. Yes.
Cool. Well, let's do a panel. Let's do a couple more of these sessions. I think this is really cool, right? And I think it's definitely a topic worth exploring. And I think especially that intersection between what you're doing with risk, with mapping, with incident response, with like what does it look like when you have those teams in the flow versus what it looks like when you don't have that in the flow, and
Yeah.
how can you
A
manufacture
control.
some of that
Yeah,
stuff?
yeah. Are we still recording or has it
Yeah, yeah,
stopped?
yeah. We can stop recording now if you want.
Oh,
Yeah, okay, cool. So, hey, great session. Thanks,
no, thanks.
thanks for this. I'll stop recording now.